Okay, so should we start? Are we on? So, hi Marcela, hi Dennis. Thank you for being here. I always think it's a little disconcerting that we can't see the other people who are seeing us, but I think that's fine. So, welcome to the Land Purpose Forum. I think this is already the third or the fourth panel, the first day. And we are going to be talking about off-grid. I think the idea is that we do a very informal chat. So no worries about presenting, like formal presentations or imagery, but just like try to, give us your insight and your ideas in a very informal way as a discussion. I think the idea of this panel was to discuss how different models of ownership and communal organization could also generate different ways that we produce, that we distribute, or that we save energy, but also open to interpretations. So I would like to introduce myself and then let you guys introduce yourselves. I am Anna Dietzch. I am a member of the international board at FICA, who is one of the organizers of the forum, a visiting professor at Cornell, and an architect from Brazil and the US. And also, you heard about the how to get the word and distribute the word. So when you want to talk, you're going to grab the word, you're going to demonstrate that you want to talk. The same thing when you want to give it back, you just give it back. So I am going to give back the word so that you can introduce yourselves.
So I'm Marcela. I'm also an architect, permaculture designer, and I'm from São Paulo originally. I've been working there in the past few years, but with the COVID-19, I came to Rio, to Petrópolis, and now I'm living here closer to a more kind of trying, equitable way of inhabiting Earth and more just and yes, I think for now that's it.
Okay. There I go. I'm Dennis. I'm a former academic in literature, and since 2018 I've been involved in a project called The Foundry, which is a residency / project space in an abandoned village in Galicia. So there we have some hands-on experience with off-grid living. Or it's not off-grid, but like we deal with these systems. I'm also involved in Freeing Space, which is a map of the world that indicates areas that try to build a world outside of state and capital somehow. These are things I'm doing. Yeah, there we go.
Amazing! I love this map. I want the link later.
Okay.
But so this is a free conversation, so just feel free to jump in whenever you want. But maybe just to get us started, I could just launch a couple of questions. Maybe it would be cool to hear you guys talking about some experience that you think is valuable or that you are proud of in terms of like the theme living off the grid. And it could relate to energy or to other system also that you want to talk about.
I can say a few words about the early days of the Foundry, which is, as I said, was an abandoned village, was abandoned since the 70s, and we arrived there in 2018. And when we arrived there was no electricity, there was water. there was no sewage. So actually, like one of the desires we had in the beginning was to get on grid, because there's a certain comfort to that, right? And as a person going through that, like what you realize in a couple months, we went from like prehistory, where you have none of these connections, no electricity to part of the time. People taught me how to pull electricity from the wires and steal it, to a relatively comfortable situation, and that liberates mental space. Because in the beginning, you have to always take into account how much sawdust you have left for your dry toilets, how far your portable battery is charged. You have how much water you heated in this like little solar heater that you made, if it's enough to do your dishes. You're always trying to like have a mental map present of all the resources that you somehow need to maintain a somewhat decent standard of living. And the moment you get more and more connected to the grid, and the grid has its own problems that I'm sure we'll talk about later, but you free up some mental space. And like it gave me a sense that culture or civilization has a lot to do with forgetting. Like you don't have the mental space to make a great painting or write a great book if you constantly need to think of like how you're going to deal with your shit, how you like. So that was a quite interesting experience to go through that, like society, civilization as a process of forgetting certain basic functions that the grid then takes upon itself. Then again, of course, the grid also has its problems, and now we're trying to detach a little bit from it and also be a bit more autonomous in our energy and food and these kind of systems. But I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Mhm. Yes. Well, this thing you just said of the freeing some mental space reminded me of this thinker and teacher, Krishnamurti. He's Indian. He was Indian. And he used to say this about the teachers, that they should have the minimum to live, so that they could worry about teaching, And in that sense, I completely understand what you're saying, and it relates also to the reality I'm working in from some years now, which is Brasilândia. It's an informal community, the second biggest slum in São Paulo. It's close to the peri-urban area, close to the nature. When the cities find nature in São Paulo, that exists, even though you may think not. And that's the thing. A lot of people are actually sparing a lot of energy into surviving, into having and fighting for the possibility of surviving. So there is no public, this the grid. There is no grid actually, nah? And people could get some access to sewage, some access to water or to food, because they have been fighting for so many years and organizing themselves and pressing the state for that. But also what we say in Brazil, doing a lot of gambiarra, like trying to get on with the resources they have and create out of what is existing. And in that sense, right now we've been working with focusing on the food system, like the whole chain of food system in the neighborhood, and understanding the public spaces as platforms for producing and for closing the system, the circularity in the neighborhood. So there was already, before we arrived there was a lot of community engagement and citizen initiatives of urban gardens. And it's really beautiful to see how the typologies are different. So you have a garden in a health center, in a school, in a backyard of someone else's house. And at the same time, you see a lot of people doing that for different reasons, of course, but a lot of the people have this how can I say, this perception of the circularity. So they worry about where the seed is coming from and what do you do with the leftover of the food. So they have this understanding of circularity, but usually it's not accompanied by a discourse, but it's mainly a practice in itself. And in that sense, I think it's really like a challenge. How do we establish and at the same time kind of defend what I think I could say of heterotopia, in the sense of this space that it's inside the grid, but it operates in a different system, a different set of rules and relationship among people. And how do we defend that this is important, right? That especially when I'm sorry, too many things, but just to finish my first comment, is that a lot of people talk about the right to the city, and it's not necessarily the right to the city as it is, as the grid as it is, as the opportunities and the equipment and everything, but it's also the opportunity of having the right to dreaming other possible cities, right? And I think people are doing it by this creative approach of dealing with the existence and stuff like that, and creating this different space inside the space. But just to start.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was discussing the panel before it happened with the other organizers, I was like, okay, so we're talking about the grid, from what point of view, right? Because they're like, well, that's going to depend who you're talking to, right? But because it does have to do, as everything has to do with social justice, right? So both of you are saying, well, we didn't have the grid, but we wanted the grid, right? Meaning access to infrastructure, right? So I think it's also a matter of thinking, like the definition of what the grid is, right? Does it need to be a centralized, overarching, amenity that is then distributed to some and not to others, right? And how we're going to be able to maybe rethink the models of how you do, you distribute or you build these new grids so that they are more flexible and they are more accessible, and have the option of being like different things in different places, right? Like when I think about the Green New Deal here in the US, and this idea that we're going to electrify every building in the states, which is one of the most consuming places of energy in the world. How do you do that, right? And I cannot believe that it will be done if it's going to be done in a centralized way, right? So I think it also has to do like this question of the energy, be it the human energy or the energy we need for the internet or the infrastructure that we need for our toilets. I think it also has to do with what you're saying, Marcela, how we organize ourselves, right? So that we can generate other types of sharing, right? And other types of access, right, to energy. And it's interesting that, you put it in the context of this community. And we here at Cornell in Ithaca, there's several intentional communities around the city of Ithaca and in the region of the Northwest New York. And it's kind of the opposite, right? I mean, these communities, they exist and they are doing very much what you're saying, what you're describing, Marcela, but they are in the other spectrum of the kind of economic, social, spectrum, like, place, And the question, I remember visiting one of these communities with students, and the first thing that they had to like comment after, going to one of these wonderful eco villages that are, doing everything community, that are trying to generate energy, that are trying to build passive houses, that are trying to kind of minimize the footprint. It was very interesting. Like, we spent 2 hours there, and we heard about all of these initiatives and all of these kind of practices, and how they did all the decisions by consensus, this and that. And the first thing, like, 15 students, the first thing they had to say is, but they're all rich, right? So I guess, I don't know, it's also about, what grid for whom, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's also, then you're talking about small communities, and I'm sure Marcella has some thoughts on like how this would work in bigger communities like cities, but it's a completely different issue, right? Like at the foundry, like I mean, we're not, because there's some like cultural heritage on the side, we're not allowed to put solar panels, and that maybe makes it more tricky to become totally self-sustaining in electricity. But in terms of sewage and food and water, I don't think it's impossible. But with a city, it would be completely impossible. And this is a problem that people like Marx and Engels already noticed, right, in the 19th century. Or that goes back to people like Justus von Liebig, like the guy who did like soil chemistry. Like if you have a concentration of people that eats in one place, but their food comes from elsewhere, and but their shit doesn't go back to that elsewhere, then you have a problem. You get concentrations of nitrogen, you get soil depletion, and that was staved off in the 19th century by like whatever, these processes to make ammoniac and stuff and blah blah blah. I'm not a specialist in this. But what people like Marx and Engels said is, no, you need to get rid of cities somehow. You need to have an even distribution of people across the land. And like I'm in Berlin now. I live in Berlin most of the time. It's hard to imagine how a place with 3.5 million people could ever sustain its own food and electricity and water needs. Like, that's hard to imagine. But of course, in eco villages, it's perfectly possible. There, another aspect that perhaps comes in there is the aspect of struggle, right? Because if we look at the history of, like, now most our energy comes from oil, I would say. And then you have there was this German guy, Hermann Scheer, who envisions this kind of decentralized energy network where everybody has a couple solar panels and there's a bit of wind going on and there's a bit of that. Sure, beautiful, and perhaps it's even possible. But looking at the history of how we came to depend on oil, it's a history like of reducing the power of the working class, right? Like with coal, the working class had too much power; they could strike. So that's why it needed to be more centralized, because you have, like, you can get a tanker full of oil from some country where the working class is not organized, and you solve the problem of striking workers. So if we envision some kind of transition to some decentralized network, that would have to imply capitalism giving up one of the strongest instruments it had in fighting against labor. They're not just going to give that up. They're not just going to give that up. So this is like, it's in thinking about these issues of how to reform the grid, how to think about electricity differently, how to think of it in a more sustainable, decentralized way. We have to understand, like, what kind of clashes of power also underlie it historically, and what would need to be overcome. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's quite complex in the sense that we know what should be done, but how do we actually do it? And I think there's also a huge problem, which is a mindset problem, in the sense of how do we comprehend what a city is, right? What landscape is, and how, because exactly the cities are, they use kind of, no, they consume 75% of the energy which is produced is to sustain a city. And the crazy thing is that this this energy is produced exactly as you said, through oil, through hydroelectric, and through a lot of different ecosystems and landscapes, which have a huge impact on Earth in general, on biodiversity and human and more than human lives. So how do we actually perceive that the city should produce, not only consume, extract, and externalize the limits, because that's what we do. We create landscapes of landfill, of garbage. This goes to the seas, whatever. But how do we understand the planet boundaries and the city boundaries and try to actually produce the energy where we consume the energy? And of course, we're also talking about diminishing how much we produce, because exactly it's just produce, and you don't know why and whom and to where you're producing, but you just keep producing. And I'm talking also about myself. I mean, we all are victims, not, but yeah, related to this paradigm in some way. But so how I think the main thing what we've been trying to think and experiment about is how do we make this just transition, and at the same time that it's about understanding the boundaries, I think it's also about expanding the boundaries, because exactly what Anna was saying is easy to have a eco village where everybody's rich and you're producing what you're consuming and you're closing the systems locally, but you have the resource, you have the investment, you have the possibility to actually do it. But what about people who are outside this margin, right? So I think that's really how do we understand that we are all in this boat, but and essentially what Anna was saying of redistribution, of decentralization, of autonomy, but recognizing that the autonomy is related to interdependence. There is no autonomy in the endogenous autonomy, like closed in itself, but how do we actually create this network, this ecosystem of partnerships, of collaboration, of flows, of relationship to the things we want to support, to the kind of life, to the kind of production of labor, of economy we want to support. So I think this is fundamental for us to actually, I love this saying of a bamboo worker from Minas Gerais, from Brazil, Lúcio Ventania. He says that it's not about thinking of alternative technologies, but it's about thinking of substitutive technologies. So how do we actually create other grid inside of the grid? And I think it's related to, of course, building infrastructure, but mainly about these organization forms, these other culture forms. It's not only infrastructure, but also culture, trying to operate in between.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that maybe, when you start talking about, then it's about, overarching power and the control, of whole sectors of society through access to infrastructure. I mean, it's very hard to not get paralyzed, right? I don't know if maybe the recipe will need to turn against itself. And I think in a way it's starting to do that. So like some years ago in New York, we had a blackout, like everything stopped. And that was, I think the first time that my daughter, who is now 18, saw a blackout was when she was 10 and she was in Brazil. And she was like, what is happening? Like, oh, it's a little bit like you said, like we forget that we have light coming from divine sources, right? And when you don't have it, you kind of remember. But so this blackout in New York was like, people were desperate. I mean, and then you start saying how pervasive it is, right? And now, reliant on internet and everything, right? The cell phone, which is everything that you have in your life is in that cell phone, being accessed by internet and electricity. And then realizing that maybe the sources are not going to be, there forever. I think there is already a lot of talk, at least here in the energy guidelines for New York State. There's a lot of talk of having different forms of grid organization, right? So not like Marcela said, it's not going to be like they're not pledging, right? The public sector is not pledging to give over power or to give over its control, but it's making it more flexible so that it can also take the load. Because when this blackout happened, it happened because it was centralized, right? The problem was in Canada. So there was an international problem that bureaucratically and diplomatically needed to be solved, and it was a mess. It took 2 days and a half to get solved, and meanwhile, businesses are going out of business, hospitals are running off on their generators. So it was like a big trauma. So maybe I always think about, maybe the system is starting to hijack itself. And maybe there is a possibility to rethink new ways of having these, a new grid distribution. And I don't know which, this experience that you mentioned, Dennis, but one way that is being very effective in New York is, of course, through tax exemption, right? And the debureaucratization of the methods and the ways that you can apply for example, solar panels. But of course, we're very far away from it being totally democratic. But what I find interesting in this kind of new, this new discourse is that if you don't have a super centralized grid, then what do you have, right? So if there is agency that is not just coming from the top, then how do you organize the agency, right? And that's when you start talking about social justice, and that's when you start talking about how communities organize, right? Because you can have a communal grid, that that feeds, some blocks, like 5-6 blocks, but if they're not organized, it's not gonna happen. So I think we need a lot of things. I think the good news is that we need a lot of things to change in a good way, and the bad news is that we need a lot of things to change, right? and maybe these more traditional or less empowered communities will also, have something to offer, right? Because they are, like you said, having to fight for spending a lot of energy to just, kind of like live, right? But they're still living, right?
Yeah, in that sense of how do you organize the agency and thinking of this kind of more distributed and the agency of the people who are in the territory, making the territory every day, not necessarily are making decisions, but are making in practice. I think when I've been seeing a lot of initiatives which relate to pedagogy, relate to actually giving tools for people to become multipliers. So I think that exactly all these people who are with us in this project of the Eco City, Eco Cidade, that we've been doing for a year now, They are definitely multipliers in the sense that they are sensibilizing other people, neighbors. They have capillarity in the territory, and they share all the habits and this kind of other culture of exactly composting, of planting your own food or buying from the neighbor and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think and we have an amazing example also from the south of São Paulo, which is a partner of ours. It's called Favela da Paz, Slum of Peace, which is Fabio Miranda, and he's been through courses with young people. He's been building, for example, solar panel in the slum, and doing kind of producing their own energy. And he recently just installed like a big amount, energy plant of solar panel in the east side of São Paulo. So I do believe that within this context of courses and pedagogy and giving tools for people, of course, not always you're giving access to the production. How do I say that? No sé. I forgot. But well, anyway.
Say it in Portuguese.
Tipo os meios de produção, né?
Yeah, the means of production.
So the infrastructure, the tools, and things like that. But you're changing a culture, you're changing a mindset, and you're giving tools for fixing and experimenting, at least prototyping. So after you prototype, you get funding, international funding, or funding from the municipalities. For example, I think Salvador, they have a thing that you pay the taxes of a building, IPTU, but you have the green IPTU. So if you can take this money and reinvest into making the more green infrastructure in the building you have and things like that. So I think this kind of incentives are important, but at the same time, this sensibilization of local community so that you organize, and at the same time there's this challenge of kind of prioritize. So prioritize. So how do you actually, because we cannot do a whole revolution at once. So okay, so now we're going to organize a calendar of mutirões, of encounters that we go there and build one infrastructure. Okay, next semester we're going to build the other infrastructure. So how do we actually organize in that sense? I think that's also a challenge.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there, right? It's like the function of these smaller projects is also to divulge and spread knowledge, and to function as signposts that other forms of living are possible. But of course, agency is always going to be both limited and situated by existing infrastructure and existing technology. And there's a path dependency to that, right? Things develop in a certain way, and then like not all moves are possible because of the history of how things have developed. You cannot say, oh, now we want a decentralized grid. Like actually Elon Musk said this at some point. If I had a button to turn off all use of fossil fuels, I wouldn't push it. Like I think we should move somewhere else. But if I would do that, like everything would fall apart. So there's a path, and I know he's evil and everything, but I decide him anyway. So there's a path dependency there, and some moves are simply impossible. But I guess the Foundry is also situated in this field that you just hinted at, right? Of projects that do try to create other forms of life that are perhaps somewhat less extractive. And the hope is that if you have many of those projects, and if you somehow manage to link them or visibilize them, this is also why I set up freeing-space.com, the map. Then at some point, perhaps you can reach some kind of critical mass in which moving towards a different form of life that is not so extractive, that is sustainable. And I am not there, not even close, but doesn't require that much sacrifice. Like that's the hope, right? And you like at the Foundry, we might this summer. I hope it goes on. I'm not sure yet. Like a person is making like kits of how to produce electricity with water, or is planning to make them, and like do some research there. But then it's like a kit that you can, as a teacher in a school, you can like set up a little hydropower plant in the school and like to show. And this is gonna be enough for one light bulb, but you do spread an awareness, and that's already a lot. Like it's hard to get too depressed and sort of like hopeless if we look at the bigger it's easy to get too depressed and hopeless if we look at the bigger issues we're fighting and like the predictions of ecologists and everything. But what else are we gonna do?
Yeah, and I think there's also the other side of the coin, right? I mean, many sides of the coin, but if you do decentralize, then you also maybe fall in the possibility of complete neoliberalism thinking. So and that's what we see, right? And then it's what it comes in terms of social justice. In Brazil, if you go if you go to rural places that don't have the grid already, what you see is that family farmers and small farmers are being killed by monoculture, because monoculture can very easily establish that kind of independent off-grid extractive system to then drain all the water, right? And then we're talking not only about water for a small property or a family, we're talking about drying up like whole sources of water production, and drying up underground water and things like that. So yeah, it is very complicated. I have a colleague here at Cornell who is also a consultant to the EU, and he was in a crit the other day, and like we were discussing the Amazon and projects in Mato Grosso, and then at the end of the day, he's like, when these people in the EU, they ask me, what is it that we need? How do we do this? And he says, decency. So I don't know. It all starts with that, right? Because when you talk about Elon Musk, I was thinking of it's funny that you mention him, because at the same time he doesn't want to push the button because everyone will suffer. He's making a rocket so he can go to Mars as fast as he can, right? And then he'll push the button. So it's like, I don't know.
You go.
No, I go. No,
I had nothing really much to say. Just like that, all the rich guys seem to do this, right? It's not just Elon Musk; it's also Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos. They're all making rockets in case things do go wrong, to have a backup plan. It's an interesting thing, and the women can stay behind, right? It's only rich men. They make rockets to move to another planet. Anyway.
No, but yeah, I think when you mentioned the path and the transition, I agree, because in a way it's quite a bit anxious to think that there is no one way, and it's quite complex, and it's quite kind of a advocacy plan that we need to tackle, like people who are from the public sector. We need to talk with companies and try to bring kind of awareness of what needs to be done, and we need to sensibilize the whole society in a way of creating other mentality and other kind of culture, urban culture, modern culture. So I think it relates a lot to what you were saying of reaching this kind of critical mass. But yeah, again, it's so scale and multi-dimensional, that it's like, how do we organize ourselves to actually, okay, I'm doing this part, you are doing this part, you're going through here. So kind of, how do we bring strategy so that, but also keep the tactics of each group, of each kind of way of fighting, so that we organize this transition, right? Because again, we won't do it by ourselves, we won't do it in a situated only way, but we need to articulate and organize in a bigger perspective. So in that sense, I would like to know a bit more, maybe from Anna, also about the Green New Deal, and if you, as being this double agent, Brazil, US, if you see that resonating in Brazil and how, and thinking of also this connection between the social and the environmental, because again, it's not just just one or the other, but it's together, and mostly in the global south in Brazil.
Dennis, do you wanna say something that you had your hand on?
Yeah, I mean, not much. I guess I wanted to point out that, yeah, personally, I'm struggling between, on the one hand, some kind of like apocalyptic hopefulness, on the other hand, right? And on the other hand, I mean, realism, right? Realistically, there have been energy transitions in the past. None of them were energy transitions. They were just an addition of a new energy source, always. Like we're burning more coal than we've ever been in history, even though we're now an oil-based economy. It's not like we stopped burning oil. The Green New Deal, it won't replace oil with green sources. Like, it's very unlikely. It's probably just gonna increase our use of energy again, which is what always has happened historically, right? And I don't want to be a hypocrite. Like, I'm part of that. I do that too. I'm a consumer, and I think most of us are. And we burn, like, if everyone on this planet would have the carbon footprint I have. And by the way, carbon footprint is a highly problematic notion because it puts the responsibility for a fucked up system on the individual, whereas it is a systemic issue, and corporations play a larger role than individuals. So it's a problematic notion that's actually been pushed by the oil industry. But if everyone would have my carbon footprint, we would be screwed, you know. And so, I mean, like, it's very tricky to position yourself in all of this. And like, I also don't think the Green New Deal will save anything. Like, you cannot spend your way out of catastrophic global warming. You cannot legislate your way out of that. But anyway, I'm sure you have more interesting things to say about that than me.
Yeah, I think the Green New Deal is a manifesto, right? To a certain level. I think and it's not a manifesto because it is something that is coming from the government establishment, right? So I think it has these two kind of edges. But I think what's interesting about the Green New Deal is formally the acknowledgement of a crisis, right? That is being, like you're saying, trying to be legislated, right? And that maybe we won't get out of the problem by legislation, but I think it's a signal that the problem is there, right? And that people are kind of like acknowledging it or not, right? I mean, the US, the other thing is, I mean, you can also today believe or not believe in things, right? So you can believe that there is no energy crisis, right? In the US, like maybe half of the country doesn't believe, or 40% of the country doesn't believe in global warming. So yeah, it's complicated, but I think because of that and because of the mindset and other things that you have mentioned, both of you, is that the Green New Deal is important, because suddenly it becomes this official, kind of like discourse, right? Political in the sense, in the White House, in the Senate, in the House. Because if you read the Green New Deal, it's nothing but a manifesto, and even a somewhat retroactive manifesto, not so progressive. It's still talking about, organization of the labor force as we saw with industrialization, right? So not progressive in the sense to reimagine what these communities or labor forces, how they could interact in a different way or could organize in a different way, in a different economy, right? So, and still assuming that we will rely on industrial consumerism and, the kind of cycle of production and consumption, which is, I agree with you, very complicated. And I don't think the answer will come from the US because of that. The US is the most efficient, right? Maybe even more than China, more than any other country, in sustaining its market, right? And being sustained by its market, right? We consume tons of energy, and we sustain this wheel at full speed, with free market, which I think not, other countries can't do still, right? Like China, you have a centralized government. Europe, you have all the kind of still, luckily, social public, interventions. So I don't think that the answer will come from the US. But what I think is interesting is that the Green New Deal is a voice within this kind of like, armature. And I think for architects and urban designers and, engineers, whatever, like the technical people, I think it's a great chance to envision, like to use it as a tool for envisioning solutions, right? That then can percolate into the mindsets of, what if, right? Because I think people also react a lot to things that are very concrete, right? They don't want to lose energy. They don't want to consume less. They don't want to, like, it's like you said, either they have something that like pops into their head and is apocalyptical, or they have to see a benefit, right? Is it cheaper? Maybe that's one way, right? Maybe if there is a breach in this new organization that comes with this pledge or this manifesto, can we make it cheaper? Can we make it more resilient? Can we make it within the kind of logic of the market, but in a different way? That's what I see about the Green New Deal. And it's not going to be, I mean, in the near future, with all this polarization that we have, it's not going to be even discussed in the Senate. But on the other hand, all of the infrastructure bill that Biden has in place, with all the resistance for voting, not voting, it's based on the Green New Deal. So I think it's very like it has a lot of problems, but I think it's at least it's the recognition of the problem in an official way, right? Because the other thing that also bugs me a lot, and I'm not a specialist about this, but is this idea of electrification. The Green New Deal is about electrifying, right? But if you think about what Marcela and you, Dennis, were saying about, where are the sources of our energy in urban centers, and we look at hydroelectric power, which is quote unquote clean power, clean for whom, right? I mean, ask the communities in, from Belo Monte and Xingu, and they're not going to think it's that clean. I mean, it has, our biggest hydroelectric plant has caused, infinite amounts of community and environmental problems. So I don't know. I think that maybe also what we need to do, like in any other thing, I think we have to go back to an economy of less, right? Less stuff. De-economize, I don't know how you say that, but
Degrowth.
growth, yeah.
No, you didn't get the word, but I got the word. Because once I read this book, it's I don't remember. It's a German author together with Alberto Acosta from Ecuador, and I participated on this conversation that they had, and it's curious because in terms of US and Europe, I think of course we can talk about big growth, but here in Brazil and Latin America, I think we need another kind of paradigm to think. Of course, Alberto Acosta brings this Buen Vivir, right, which I think has an important role because all the time we've been talking about kind of grassroots and community or organizations, but at the same time we need to understand and we need to fiscalize and we need to um, um, I don't know, give taxes also for the impacts which are generated and visibilize the impact as and I was talking about the hydroelectrics, and I think also transforming the impact into a measurable kind of way. How big is the impact? How much does it cost for the communities, for the environment, and things like that? And also try to organize ourselves in a way of competing, right? As Dennis was putting, that the technology is not completely transformed into from one to the other, but needs to be accessible. It needs to be democratic. So sometimes I don't know. For example, in São Paulo, when we talk about the garbage or the water, we have these big companies, private companies, which do the management of these resources. But most of the times, for example, the water company, they don't treat the water in the peripheries, the water of the sewage. They just throw the water into the river. So I mean, how come still 2022 the company is doing this and in a place that's not really doesn't have this visibility? So how do we also organize ourselves to propose a different model of dealing with these commons, with managing these commons, right? So in that sense, I think right now we've been living this in the project. How does it actually has permanence, sustain itself through time? So how do we organize this kind of other economies exactly? And I like to think of this. I think it's a less also, but I like to think of this idea of a care economy in the sense that we are caring for the people, we are caring for the environment, and trying to, and also for the more vulnerable beings which are there. Yeah.
All right. I haven't researched the Green New Deal or something, but so I get, but based on what I read about it in the news, it seems to be that it promises kind of to change everything, but also to keep everything the same. Meaning it's going to solve everything, but within a capitalist framework. And capitalism is a growth-based economy. So, like, I mean, how are you going to have a growth-based economy in an ecological way? I think without overthrowing capitalism, this is a dead end, to be honest. And you can make global rules, and you can come up with some sort of like notion of the global commons. But the notion of commons is connected to community. There is no global community. Like all the commons that Elinor Ostrom talks about, they're like local settings where people are dealing with a resource together. On a global level, I mean, perhaps this needs such a big paradigm shift in how we think of the world. And like I like it's very hard to even imagine it. And then if someone doesn't follow those rules and takes an advantage out of it, it's like, then it's like Bush not signing the Kyoto protocols, right? Like there will always be some asshole like that. So this is all. But I think what more than anything, with stuff like the Green New Deal or whatever, like Europe comes up with, indicates is like a sclerosis of political imagination, or a lack of political imagination somehow. And now people even talk about geoengineering and like shooting fucking airplanes with sulfur into the air, and then they're gonna solve the problem. The fact that you're talking about this kind of large scale intervention globally in the climate system, and that it's easier to consider that, which would in effect give fossil fuels a new lease on life, right? Because if you found another solution to be able to keep burning oil, great. If that is easier to imagine than imagining overthrowing capitalism, that's a lack of political imagination. And I mean, I see places like the Foundry not just as like experimenting with like different forms of energy, or like these eco villages that you have everywhere, but also with different forms of life that are not really part of that. But it's all super small scale, right? The hope is that at some point you reach a critical mass. But that I mentioned that before already. I'm not super hopeful there or anything, but yeah, political imagination. I think that's an important word as well.
Yeah. I got a warning here. We have 5 minutes to close. I don't know, Marcela, do you want to say something before we close?
I think this last saying of Dennis reminded me of some sayings you see in the city. That once I saw this one that we talk about a lot of about speculation, right? But it was imaginative speculation. So I think that's what we need to do, and that's how it's important to visualize these cases and to show that these initiatives are doing their own ways of existing, and to sharing and spreading the word, so that people have the courage to do it themselves locally in a situated perspective, and connect. I think what we're doing here, and later I will put some spaces in the freeing space, and we keep exchanging, because I think that's how we actually manage to build this path together, right? Thank you so much for the invitation and for the talk.
Thank you, guys. And yeah, when Dennis was talking, I remembered one day I went into my room. My husband was sleeping at 3 a.m, and the TV was on. And I saw this surreal thing, like this guy, this scientist in Alaska who had been dropped from, a helicopter, and was putting this like high-tech blanket on the polar circles, like to see if he could stop somehow the melting of the polar. So yeah, I think that it's gonna be a mix of everything, right? A little bit of apocalypse, if that is possible, only a little bit, but also I think the realization, yeah, that we need to be structured in a different way. It's interesting because I'm always dealing with young people, in the university. These kids are 18, 19, 20 years old, and at the center of capitalism, right? At the center of the beast. But they're very much, I think the word is not that one anymore. I don't think that they relate to capitalism, non-capitalism, or socialism. I think the labels are different, but I think they're very much aware that it's not, it will not be what it is now or what it was. And things like, I have heard things like, no, but I don't save. I believe in saving, because when I'm 60 years old, when I'm old, right? 60 years old, I'm not going to need the savings anymore. It's going to be another thing, right? So I've heard this in different forms. So, and probably it's not going to take only 40 years, but for sure, slow and how do you say this in Portuguese? We say slow and always we go as humankind. But thank you. Dennis, do you want to say a last word?
No, thank you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao.